Hello, friends. Welcome to On the Couch program. We are super excited that you'll be joining us. On the Couch is going to be aired every Friday evening at 7 p.m. on our YouTube channel. This program will be focused on answering questions around really difficult topics of finance, family dynamics, parenting, dating, and divorce. So if any of these topics are affecting anyone that you care about or even yourself, please tune in for some biblical answers. We would love to hear from you as well on your own questions. So please send that in to our email address, which will be located in the details below. Thanks so much. We look forward to hearing from you.
Financial problems, troubled family relationships, unplanned pregnancy, broken marriage, delinquent children, or overwhelming grief. Are you burdened by the care of life? Are you feeling hopeless? Friend, whatever you are going through, whatever questions you may have, God has the answers. We invite you to join us on the Couch, a Bible-based program that will give you insight into what the Bible says about these critical issues of life. We present to you On the Couch, finding hope in the midst of a crisis.
Welcome to another episode of On the Couch, a show brought to you by the Seventh-day Adventist Church here in Houston, by Sugarland Access, and by the Fil-Am Church. We're really happy to have you, Pastor Escalante. Let me start that over. Hold on.
Okay, me too. It's okay.
It's okay. You're doing great.
I know. Okay.
It's a different setup because normally we're in face-to-face with the person, Daniel. So
it's because I'm trying to remember to look at the actual camera. So yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's try it again.
No worries.
Sorry.
No worries. Okay, ready? 5.
Welcome to another episode of On the Couch, a show where we talk about a range of topics from family dynamics to divorce, to relationships, to economics and your money, and a show that's brought to you by the Seventh-day Adventist Church here in Houston, by Access and by Fil-Am. And this evening, we're really excited to have Pastor Escalante with us, who will be talking to us about family dynamics. Pastor Escalante, thank you so much for being with us. And if you could tell us a little bit about who you are, a little bit about your background, we would really appreciate it before we get started with this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Just thank you so much for having me as well. I'm very excited to be here with you all this evening. And so my name is Daniel Escalante, and I am a senior pastor in Savannah, Georgia. Right now, I've been here for coming up on about 2 years now. And so I've actually been here during more time in a pandemic than actually started the ministry. But so that's been very exciting, but it has been quite the adventure so far. And I'm here with my wife. And so we're both very excited to see what God has in store for us. But originally, I did not grow up here. I grew up in Houston, Texas. And so a lot of the members I know from Access Church. And so it's great to be able to see you all and to speak with you all this evening on this topic. And so most of you might know my parents as well. Ruth Escalante is my mom. And my aunt also might go there sometimes as well, too. I do have a younger brother that's also decided to stay in Houston. So I was the only one that decided to leave the nest, so to speak. But yeah, so that's a little bit about myself. And I'm just happy to be here.
Thank you, Pastor. So the world that we live in today, I mean, you mentioned it while you were talking about your background a little bit. We live in a COVID world right now. Thankfully, things are getting a little bit better. But we've seen a lot of death. We've seen a lot of sickness, a lot of different things. And these things touch the family. You know, I know a few families, not necessarily personally, but people that I connect with and people that I know that have lost loved ones. Mm-hmm. So to start off this conversation, not to get too heavy on the topic, but how do we deal in this time, in these days, in this day, actually, in the days that we're actually in, how do we deal with family members that are suffering illness and possibly family members that are terminally ill?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And Yeah, unfortunately, this pandemic has made us face this reality almost on a day-to-day basis. Definitely usually maybe a family or even during the church experience, church life. We would hear about, people getting sick and people having family members pass away maybe every few months or something like that. The time was, few and far between, but definitely the pandemic has been something that has just escalated that and, has made us, death, unfortunately, already is something that's uncomfortable to talk about. It's really uncomfortable to deal with. It's very difficult for not just for the person that might be sick, but even for the family, for church members as well, the church family as well. It's very difficult. And so to already have to deal with it on a day-to-day basis, like we have been in the last couple of years, or the last years, is been very, very difficult and has brought the subject to the forefront in our minds. And one of the things that I've learned in our churches, thankfully, we did have a few members towards the beginning of the pandemic that got sick, and even recently we've had a few family members that have tested positive for COVID. But thankfully, no one has, at least in our congregations, have passed away from it yet. But if anything, we've had other challenges as well. Other family members that have had cancers and things like that. And in my experience, being able to minister to these families, one of the things that I've had to learn quickly was that there are no words that can fix the situation at all. Many times we might get stuck on that idea of like, oh, we have to find the right Bible verse, the right promise, the right thing to say. But I think one of the first things we have to remember is that there are no right words. There's nothing that we can say. There's nothing that we can do that can take away the discomfort or take away the pain that the family or the individual might be facing. So if anything, it becomes even more of a call to really learn not just what it is that we should say, but it's a call to explore more about what the ministry of presence is all about. And that is, I think, ultimately, that is one of the most important things that we could devote our time to is how is it that we can be present with the family? How is it that we can enter that space of where we're sitting next to the person that is sick or that is might be dying soon or things like that, or even sitting next to the family that is grieving. How can we do so comfortably and know that and just being a presence there for them to comfort them in that situation? I think that's ultimately one of the best things that we can do.
Thank you, Pastor. So, it's one thing when it happens unexpectedly. We talk about, COVID is kind of unexpected. It comes, it takes over the body pretty quickly, and those that suffer and die relatively quickly. Yeah. But then there's the slow death that we talk about, like with cancer. We talk about these illnesses that are detected, for older family members and even the younger family members, like children. How do we deal with that? We tend to focus on, well, why does God allow these certain things, or why would God allow illness or sickness? And, could you talk a little bit more about that? Is how do we deal with watching somebody suffer for a prolonged period of time, a family member, somebody that we love, and how do we come to terms with that?
Yeah, that's excellent question. That is sometimes I feel like the unexpected deaths might be a bit easier to deal with in comparison, just because when someone is sick and is sick for a really long time, you as a person that loves that member, you don't want to see them suffer. You don't want to see them sick or anything like that. But then you're caught in between like a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand, you don't want to see them suffer. So you want them to feel at peace, to feel at ease. But then on the other hand, you don't want them to, you want to keep that family member with you for as long as possible. And so I think there's this tension, incredible tension that happens in the family, where you're struggling between those two areas of you want that person with you as long as possible. But then at the same time, you don't want them to be suffering anymore. And I think we have to realize that part of that battle comes from the desire that we have this fear of facing life without them as soon as they pass away. And so I think anything that we can try to do to come to that acceptance of, well, you know what, my family member is going to pass away, but At least they won't be suffering anymore. Anything that we can do to kind of help them and help the family member get to that point of acceptance, I think would ultimately be one of the best things that we can do. It's definitely not an easy road, but once we can accept, what the reality of the situation, that there's no changing what's about to happen, I believe that allows us even more opportunities to be able to minister to the family in other ways. I can give an example of a family that we had quite recently, actually, that the father of the family was diagnosed with a cancer, and it was kind of a roller coaster of a situation because a few months ago he went. They detected it. They detected something in his body, and they said, we're going to operate. We're going to do the biopsy, take some scans and things like that, and see what we're dealing with. And yeah, it turns out that it was cancer. But they told him, what, we got it all. They did a whole surgery for him, and for about a month or two, everything was fine. And then all of a sudden, he started feeling some more discomfort and pain. And so he goes back to the doctor, to try to figure out what is all the discomfort. Maybe it's just, some a result from the surgery. And it turns out that the cancer had come back even more aggressively. And at that point, he was given just 4 months left to live. And yeah, that was such a shock for him and his family, because how do you go from one point of like, oh, what, we got it all, you're gonna be fine, to all of a sudden you've got 4 months left to live. And so so part of the experience that we've been journeying with the family has been exactly that. The kids have been trying to navigate, his wife has been trying to navigate, trying to prepare for life after her husband, but at the same time, trying to take advantage of all the time that they do have together and making the most of that. So I've seen that he's been just trying to spend more time with his kids, trying to spend more time with his wife. And me as a pastor, one of the things that we've, aside, from just, being available to his calls and things like that, one of the things that we tried to do was, we took the kids out for just a fun evening, hung out with them, spend some time with them, so that one, we could get to some one-on-one time with them. And also he and his wife could have some time together as well. So, but yes, there's no easy way around it. It's really just trying to be there with the family as they go through those stages of trying to figure out, how to navigate life around this reality.
Would you say that there are different stages to death, or is there a difference between death and dying? So sometimes we tend to think of, them being separate, but is there really a difference between death and dying?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there is a difference. When I just pondering on the question, like, I feel like death is something that we see as death is something that we've all kind of understood. Like, we all have to come to that at one point. We all kind of have it at the back of our minds, but youth and things like that, it's not always something that we're always thinking about. But on some level, we all realize, death is something we all have to face. Dying, on the other hand, is something that's much more present in and kind of like intrudes upon our life. It's something that you then start to see either in a loved one or someone that's sick. And you start to see the consequences of what dying means for an individual. It's not something that's just sudden. It's not something that just happens, but automatically it's something that, like, you see them start to weaken. You see them start to deteriorate in their health and their strength. And yeah, it just becomes an ever more present thing in your life to face. And it's something that I think becomes more real. So death might be something that we always have in the back of our minds, that maybe we even think like, oh yeah, in 60, 70 years, 80 years, that's where I'm going to get to, face that. I'll deal with it then. But dying, on the other hand, that is something, if you are in that situation where you can say, I'm dying right now, or you're in a situation where you could say, yes, I know a person that is dying right now. It's something that becomes much more present and much more like current in your situation right now. So I believe, yeah, there is a difference. And I believe that dying is one of those where it just becomes, you start to see the reality of it even more.
I do find that very interesting that and you hit the nail on the head when you said that we tend to think, well, death is going to come for me eventually. Mm-hmm. And that's, I'm 30 years old right now. So I'm thinking death is going to come for me in the next 40 to 50 years. If I'm lucky, I'll live to be 80 something years old. Mm-hmm. And I don't have to worry about that. I'll be old. My kids will, mm-hmm. they'll know that, that's an eventuality and that's pretty much the end of it. But to think, I have a daughter that's 1.5 years old. To think that I could possibly die, not that I am going to succumb to death eventually, but the thought of me dying anytime soon is really something hard to deal with, and it comes back to to when we're talking about the topic of family dynamics, is how do I prepare my family for that eventuality that could come at any moment. I could be driving home, not to be morbid, but I could be driving home tonight after our interview, get into a car accident, and that's it. Thankfully I walked away saying, I love you to my wife, I love you to my daughter. I gave them both a hug, I gave them both a kiss. But it's hard to deal with that reality that it could happen at any moment. And going to the Bible, it tells us, that, you don't know, and when it talks about the coming of Jesus, you don't know the time or the hour, but that's the same thing could be applied to death, because you don't know. And we always have to be ready for that reality. So I think that's very interesting, that there is a huge difference between, considering that death will come for me eventually, or the reality of dying, which is something that we have to come to terms with. Because until we can grasp that, it doesn't become a reality, and that needs to be a reality for us. Exactly. Not so much that we focus on it all the time, where we become recluses and don't want to leave the house, but also that we just understand that it is a possibility, and we need to have a plan in place for our families to get to that point. So I think that's making that this distinction for young families and for older families is very, very important, that there is a difference.
Exactly. Yeah. And I really like that you mentioned that about planning and preparing and making sure that you're aware that it's a reality. Because you're absolutely right. At any point, one of my churches is actually an hour away from where I live here in Savannah. It's located in Brunswick. And even though it's not something that's on my mind all the time, I am very aware that, at any point, a car accident or something could happen along that 1 hour stretch of road, that journey to get to that church. Anything could happen along that way. And even more so, like it was brought to my attention a couple of days ago when I was journeying with a friend of mine, taking him back home to Brunswick. And we saw about like 4 or 5 different accidents involving trucks and things like that. And one of those had happened like literally maybe just like half an hour after I had passed that route. And so I think it's important, to realize that it's a reality, and that reality should affect how we interact with our families, our kids, our spouses. It's one of the reasons that maybe I don't think about it, but it's one of the reasons many of us, before we leave the house, make sure that we kiss our spouse, or kiss our kids, say, goodbye, so that at least we're leaving on a positive note. Because as soon as we walk out that door, we don't know what could happen. Nothing is really guaranteed to any of us. So I definitely do think that reality should affect how we interact with one another. And it's one of those unspoken things too, because, when was the last time that we asked ourselves, why is it that I kiss my wife before I leave anywhere, or my kids? And it is that unspoken truth. It's because I don't know what may happen to me as soon as I walk out. And so we don't want to leave, on a negative note or fighting. Because even thinking about it a little bit more down the road, if something were to happen to us, one of the hardest things for families to deal with is like, oh my goodness, the last thing I said to them was a word in anger, or the last thing I said to them was a criticism, was something negative. And that guilt can weigh on a family for years to come. And it's just something they'll have to face down the road. So absolutely. I'm definitely in agreement with you.
So talking about, touching a little bit on the subject of communication and the way that we talk to our families, how do we improve communication from the aspect of death, but everything else in every aspect of our lives? How do we improve our communication with our families? Sometimes I get home at 5:15, 5:30 sometimes, and I feel like, sometimes we sit in dinner in silence. We talk a little bit about our days, but communication goes so much further than just asking each other, how was your day, and what did you do today? How do we improve our communication with our families?
That's a great question. And by no means is this something that I have down, to a science or perfect at all. I've been married for over 5 years now. And so communication is just something we realized from the very beginning that it was going to be important. But at the same time, it is something that you have to be very intentional about, especially after the years, after, time goes by, because you kind of get comfortable, and especially with what you're saying, you get into a routine, you come home, and maybe even at the back of our mind, some of us might say like, oh, you know what, I'll check in with them tomorrow, or I'll check in with them later. I'm just too exhausted right now. So we do have to have these intentional moments of creating communication with our loved ones. Yeah, not just in the aspect of, if someone's sick or anything like that, but just in the day-to-day life. One of the things that helped my wife and I to realize just how important communication was we were long distance when we were dating. We were long distance for 3 years before we got married. And so she was in Colorado, I was studying in Tennessee. And yeah, it was 3 years to the day that the long distance ended for us and we were able to get married and things like that. It was great. But during that time, when you don't have, like that ability to just be like, oh yeah, let me come over right now, or let's go out to eat together or something, communication just becomes critical. We communicated through any and whatever means possible. We used Skype, we used, text messages, video calls, things like that. We had movie nights over video calls where we would literally just share the screen and hit play at the same time. And that was our movie nights. But we realized, yeah, communication is very important. And I think that one of the ways, or one of the things that helped us to be successful in our dating relationship and even in our marriage now is what I would say, creating those safe spaces for communication. So when we were dating, we were very intentional about saying, okay, this is going to be date night, so nothing touches that time, that you guard that time, you guard it faithfully. And so, but even now as we were married, we realized that it had to be a little bit deeper than just, having, an evening for fun. So we actually started trying to schedule, like these pockets of safe communication. I'm not sure what else to call them. Maybe someone has a better term for that, but it's really just a time where we sit down together and yeah, we'll lay out a few ground rules for the communication. We'll say we're about to talk to each other. It could be about our day, could be about what we're feeling, could be something stressful that's on our minds. And we'll just say, you know what, during this time, you'll have your chance to talk. I'll have my chance to talk. No one's going to interrupt anyone, and no one's going to be distracted. So we set aside our phones, and no one's going to get upset about towards anyone either, no matter what gets said. So this is a space where you can express yourself. You can say whatever it is that you want. I won't get mad at you. You won't get mad at me, and we'll just have vulnerable, honest communication. I believe that is important, not just for a couple, but for a family to have too. It's because I do believe that there are so many times in our day-to-day life that we almost like tiptoe on eggshells. We think twice before we say something because we're like, oh, is this the right time? They seem busy, they seem distracted, but I really need to talk to them about this. So should I bring it up? You know what, I'm just going to bring it up, and you bring it up and it turns into World War III because of it. Then you feel like, oh, why did I bring it up? I knew I shouldn't have said anything. So sometimes that can be part of the routine. And so how do we fight against that? It is by creating, those safe spaces where you can communicate and say, you know what, this is going to be our time to share, and it's going to be vulnerable. It's going to be open, and it's going to be our time for us. So I think definitely that's one thing that could definitely help.
So, as one of the aspects of communication is, what role do our respective parents take in our relationship? Do we give them, do we give them the keys to the house? Or is it open door invitations? How do we deal with our in-laws? I think communication goes a long way when it comes to how are we going to interact with our in-laws? My wife and I have kind of a routine that on Sabbath, one Sabbath we'll go eat at my parents' house, the other Sabbath we'll go to her parents' house, and then we go back and forth that way for various reasons. One, it's lonely to eat at home by ourselves, but we want to interact with our family. So, but not everyone has that great relationship with their in-laws. So what advice would you give to somebody that is having trouble or is thinking about getting married, and where do we set up boundaries with our in-laws? Do we, how do we do that?
That's a great question, and I've been blessed, that I do have positive relationships with my in-laws, but that is a conversation that is very important to have, especially around boundaries. I will share something that was told to me by a counselor, and yeah, specifically talking about this topic of how do you develop boundaries with your in-laws and things like that. And she said to me, peace in your home is more important than anything else. So, and that is just something that stuck with me, because if you have this relationship with your in-laws where anything that whenever they come over or you go over to them, it causes more friction, more, I guess, negative consequences from that interaction in your home, then that's a sign that something needs to change in that relationship. And yeah, it comes back to a conversation that needs to be had around boundaries. And yeah, just opening up to them and say, and yeah, it's something that should probably happen, between you and your spouse first. That way, it's united, something that you come together, a compromise that you come together, and then you communicate it to your in-laws. Like, what are the rules of our interaction going to be to guard the peace in our home? And so I think that's definitely, it does just come back to boundaries, and I would say also, not feeling guilty about setting up those boundaries, because sometimes, we might say, oh my goodness, how is it that I can tell my mom, or my dad, the very people that took care of me for so many years, how is it that I can tell them, like, oh, they can't come right now, or that they can't come, unexpectedly, things like that. But and so yeah, that might weigh on your mind and be like, I feel so guilty for having said that and things like that. But at the end of the day, you're taking care of your own home, and you're not saying that you don't love them, you're not saying that you don't appreciate them or things like that. You're just communicating that, this, to guard, the space in our home, this has to be the times where you can come over, or this is the kind of relationship that we can have. And so I believe that is probably the best area to start, would be, what kind of boundaries are you trying to set up? What kind of boundaries would guard the peace in your home? And then try not to feel, I know it's difficult, but try not to feel guilty about setting up those boundaries as well. Yeah.
So switching gears a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about, the in-laws, a lot of these principles are rooted in the Bible. The one of the commandments says, honor your mother and your father. It doesn't say just when you're at your house. That's a lifelong thing. You're always going to honor your father and your mother.
Absolutely.
But the Bible also goes on to say, when you are married, when you're united, you will leave your mother and your father and become one flesh.
Mm-hmm.
And as Christians, we grow up understanding these things, but not everybody has those same principles. Some things are cultural, some things are traditional. How do we deal with the spouse that doesn't understand that, or that mocks the faith that we have? The Bible goes into to not be unequally yoked. There's a Bible verse on that. But how do we deal with a spouse that doesn't necessarily understand our faith, or where we're coming from when it comes to certain things?
That's a great question. And yeah, that is a very common situation that we face, not just in churches, but just in the world in general. Sometimes as Christians, we might think that, oh, everyone grew up here, and, about not being, about being unequally yoked, and, you should avoid that and things like that. But many people that come through the doors of our church, grew up differently, different culture, different background, different lessons. And so many of them maybe didn't have that chance to hear that lesson. And so now they find themselves in a relationship, a relationship that the church is also telling them, you shouldn't get divorced. But yeah, they're finding this friction within that relationship. So what is it that they can do? And I do believe that it all, within the relationship, it comes back to communication. One of the things that I would advise is, because this is just something that I see oftentimes within these couples is, and this is why I'm saying this, but try not to see it as your responsibility to defend God about faith and things like that. I believe that God is big enough that he doesn't need us to defend him. So what he's asking us to do within our relationship is to navigate and try to find some compromise. Many times when faith becomes an issue is because one person is feeling like it's being thrust upon them, or that it's being pushed on them, whenever they're not ready for those steps. So maybe the spouse is feeling like, you know what, I've been going to church every single Saturday. I love it. I enjoy it. I want my spouse to come. But instead of coming back to that safe space of communication, they'll maybe try to kind of keep insisting, every single week, just come, just come, just come. Maybe a better avenue might be, you know what, I would love for you to come. Can we compromise on maybe one Saturday a month that you come and join me just to see? And if church is too much, they're having this get together, lunch or dinner or something. How about you come with me to that, just so you get to know the people, and then we could talk about, coming to church later on. So for those couples, I feel like it's almost like taking baby steps in coming and getting to know the church, while others might already be, they grew up in the context, and so they know what to do, what to say. And so it comes second nature to them. These couples are having to learn how to have those communications and how to set up those steps. Now, I will say this also, that no, any person that loves their spouse wouldn't make them feel that, if they feel that they're doing something that is right according to their conscience and, trying to live by faith, no spouse that loves you would try to put you down for that. So I believe there's a fine line between, where you have to kind of be careful and maybe even ask yourself, like, okay, has this kind of gone into the area of verbal abuse or things like that? So, we want to avoid that type of communication. But sometimes I remember an example of a couple that politics started becoming a very big thing in their relationship. So every time, both of them saw things differently, and one person was coming from the perspective of like, oh, but it's against the Bible and things like that, and the other person just wasn't having it. So it always caused like so much friction. And she came to that realization too of, what happens if I just kind of lay down my sword, for right now, if I just take a moment and just, like, we can have and just agree to disagree. And that was one of the points in their relationship where that arguing just stopped. And so it became one of those things where they're like, that's just something we haven't been able to see eye to eye, but it's okay. It doesn't affect how we feel about each other. He respects me still, I respect him still. And so it's just something that we realize that still causes a lot of friction. But it's not wrong to come to that compromise and be like, maybe this is something that, we just agree to disagree for now, and we can come back to it later on.
I think that's very key, that when we get married, we think that we need to agree on everything, or we need to come to a solution on every single issue. And the reality is that that's not always going to be the case. Like you just mentioned,
Yeah.
it could be as simple as a discussion. It's not simple, but it could be something as how many kids are we going to have? And
Exactly.
well, we agreed on 4 at the beginning, but then now you're changing your mind to 2, and now you only want 1. And it could be something as simple as that, or something as divisive, quote unquote, divisive as politics, or something like money handling or anything like that. And there are certain things where, yes, there needs to be a solid compromise, because we can't disagree when it comes to money. I'm not going to go and spend $1,000 every month, and then the bills aren't going to get paid. But I'm also not going to be so tight about it where there's no room to spend any money. And that's a whole conversation in itself. But like you said, there needs to be that fine line where we have to realize that it's not always going to be copacetic. It's not always going to be sunshine and rainbows. There are going to be disagreements. There are going to be things where we don't agree with, and that's perfectly fine. And that's an extremely hard concept to grasp. We have different personalities. I'm more, I want to resolve the issue now. My wife is more, well, let's take a step back, and we'll each go to our own corners, and then we'll come back to the solution. And it takes a lot for me to say, okay, you know what, you're absolutely right. Let's both calm down, be calm and cool and collected, and then return to the issue if we need to. If the issue dies there after we, cool heads prevail, then we just let the issue lie and then move on. But it is, I think it's a hard lesson to understand, but it is a very important one for us to understand. And I think that also goes, goes to the question, what does obey your husband in the Lord or obey your spouse in the Lord mean? What does that necessarily mean, especially when it comes to things that we don't agree with?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a great segue into from what we were just talking about. And yeah, that's kind of where I would add. It's a fine line. It's like you're trying to get to that point in your relationship where you can fight fair, you can agree to disagree, and realize that you can compromise without, without any hard feelings towards the other person. And when it comes to obeying your husband in the Lord, I believe that one of the things that means is that. Um, just like we said earlier, just like you mentioned earlier, the Bible tells us that when we marry our spouses, the two become one flesh, and the Bible even goes further to say that there's no one that hates themselves. If we are one flesh, to go against your spouse is almost like you're going against yourself, and that's just not the right position, I guess. But there is the Bible does give us some guidelines. There is a line, and obeying your husband, the key part in that phrase is obeying your husband in the Lord. And I believe that means that you continue to obey your husband so far as where he is leading you doesn't go against what you believe the Bible and your conscience and is teaching you, and you're learning to along the way as well. So obeying your husband in the Lord, might look like maybe something like a path that you might not take is if he says, you know what, let's go to I don't know, some clubs or some bars or something. I want you to come with me. That might be a situation where maybe some families might feel some tension and be like, oh, but I have to join him. He's my spouse. I have to be there next to him. I have to be by his side at all times. But it's a place that I don't like. I don't like the environment. I don't like to be there. That would be, I believe, an example of, that would be a situation where you're okay to say, and you lay down those boundaries, like that is something that I will not allow to come because of the way that it affects myself. And if that person loves you enough and respects you enough, they should respect that decision to say, okay, I understand it's not for you. At the same time, we can't force the other person. So especially in those early stages of growing and getting to know one another, it might be something where you have to say, you know what, you go ahead, but just be safe, or, something like that. It just comes back to that compromise and things, and, and having that agree to disagree mentality. And yeah, coming back to maybe later on, you can have that conversation with your spouse. Look, I really understand that is something that you like to do, but I want you to see, that it's affecting your family, and if it's something that has really been causing like enough friction and tension and just a negative environment at home, trying to get them to see from that point that their decisions, because yeah, we might all be free to make our own choices, but we're not free from the consequences. And a husband that chooses, or a wife that might choose to do something like that, regardless of how it makes their family feel, will have to deal with the consequences of how it affects the family dynamic at home. So sooner or later, they can't be surprised when they come home to face the music, so to speak. And so I believe that, yeah, obeying your husband in the Lord is something we should all strive towards, respecting our spouses and things like that, but only in as much as it doesn't go against what we see clear Bible teachings to be, and it doesn't violate our conscience as well.
One of the things that I see a lot, or that we see a lot, is arguments. Arguments stem from lack of communication. A spouse, like you just mentioned, a spouse maybe wants to do something that I don't want to do, something that could go against my beliefs, or maybe it's just one of those things where I want pizza tonight and my wife wants a hamburger, and we disagree on that. How do we handle arguments when it comes to our families, especially if we have children? How do we handle those things?
That's a great question. I always remember one of the early marriage seminars that my wife and I attended with doctors Les and Leslie Parrott, I believe are their names. And they have some excellent books and resources on the topic of how to argue, and their perspective is how to fight fair. And I remember one of the points that they brought to our attention that always stuck in my mind was your spouse is not your enemy. And so many times when we get into arguments, we see red, and we start to see the other person, and we start to treat them as if they are our enemy. They're the argument that I have to defeat. They're the ones that I have to, convince and change and things like that. But fighting fair is learning to see that person as that they're still your spouse. They're still the person that you chose to be with, that you chose to spend your life with. So just because you disagree on something doesn't make them your enemy. So that was something that we have tried to implement in our relationship, even when we have arguments, because they happen. Arguments happen. It's natural. But the way that we handle those arguments is what makes all the difference for our relationship. So we try to, whenever we get into those discussions, we try to still see each other not as enemies, but as people that, like, okay, you have your perspective, I have mine. Where is the middle ground for us right here? What is it? And I believe in those conversations, the most important thing is not to try to get that person to see or to come to your way of thinking. But what you want to try to do is you're aiming for understanding. You're trying to understand why it is that they feel so strongly about what they're saying. And you might say, you know what, I don't agree with you, but I finally understand why you feel the way that you do. And that understanding is going to make the difference for how you handle that argument or that discussion. So that would be my two things when it comes to arguments is don't treat each other like your enemies, and aim for understanding one another in the moment. Once you have that understanding, it's going to make all the difference for how you resolve the situation too.
So would you say that when it comes to arguments, should we do it in front of our kids, or should we wait for a different moment to step away so that our kids don't see that we're arguing?
That's a great question. I would say my advice would be, and I've seen both examples. My family, they had arguments in front of us occasionally, but for the most part, what I remember from them is that they would try to resolve it off screen, I guess you could say, away from us. And so I think so there are pros and cons, I believe, to both approaches. At the end of the day, I don't believe there's always like a right way when it comes. It depends on the family. But I do think that it is important for the kids to also understand how to argue, how to fight fair as well. So if you take that approach of saying, you know what, we're never going to argue in front of the kids, that's great. But understand that what you're trying to shield them from is from maybe the words or the emotions that you might express, which is great because maybe it might be too strong for them to see and they might not get it right then and there. But you have to understand I think the consequence of that too is then maybe if you don't ever take the chance to explain what happened, or explain to them, like, how they can manage their emotions, then they might grow up, realizing like, oh, it's not normal to fight in relationships, because I never saw my parents fight, so therefore it must not exist. Mm-hmm. And then that becomes like a fallacy that they fall into. And when they get into their first argument with their spouse, it becomes like this huge shock, like, oh my goodness, I can't believe we're fighting right now. This isn't right. This must mean that we're not right for each other. We're doing something wrong or something. So it all comes back to the understanding. And I believe if you take that approach, it might be healthy to have that conversation with your kids, when you guys are calm, and just say, and you don't even have to say, if they see you arguing, or if they see you about to get into it, say, your mom and I, we had a disagreement. This is how we resolved it. But maybe what might be more healthy is just having healthy conversations about arguing in general, helping them to see like, what is it that you can do when someone disagrees with you or things like that, and how to express their emotions too, if they're upset or frustrated or anything like that as well.
I think one of the things that tends to lead to arguments among parents in front of their children is that we don't discuss certain things beforehand. We don't have a plan beforehand. And sometimes as a parent, you tell your kid, go ask your mom, or the mom says, go ask your dad. Mm-hmm. Should we, not necessarily in order to avoid these arguments, but should we be discussing a wide range of things for our children beforehand, or is saying ask your mom or ask your dad a good thing to do?
Absolutely. I think that what you mentioned, having that plan ahead of time, is really important. And sometimes, ask your mom or ask your dad almost seems like, or it might come across in some occasion as kind of like you're trying to get away from the conversation. Like you might not know, so you're just relying on, whatever, mom or dad says. The thing is like you open yourself up to the surprise of like what mom or dad says. Like if it's not what you also think should happen, then that is when it becomes like, wait, what did you tell, such and such, why did you tell them that? I would have told them, not to do that. And so it's definitely important for, I believe, the couple or the parents to have, that wide range of conversations beforehand. So when the situations come up, you're on the same page, and I believe that being on the same page, or at least being united, you might not agree with each other on certain occasions, but as long as you're on the same page with one another and willing to support one another, I think ultimately that's what's most important for the kids, is that mom and dad, are united. And the way to get to that united front is yeah, you have those conversations ahead of time. So when the situations come up, because they will come up, you can't always plan for everything, but you can try your best. But sometimes they'll just pop up out of nowhere. You might have your son asking you about death or something, and you realize like, wait, where's this coming from? We haven't talked about this yet. They will pop up, but if you and your spouse can be on the same page with, okay, we've talked about this, you can definitely counsel your children along those lines. And always also too, afterwards, if it ever happens, like one-on-one, let your spouse know afterwards too. Be like, you know what, as soon as you get a chance, hey, our kids were asking about this is what I said. So just in case, if that way they're not blindsided either with the same question, because kids might do that too. They'll ask mom in one instance and just to see how mom thinks, and then they'll ask dad later on just to see what he thinks, to see if they'll get the same answer. And so it's definitely important to try to be on the same page there.
I think touching on that a little bit more, as parents, sometimes we like to keep the other parent out of the loop. Sometimes it's with good intentions. You had ice cream before dinner, don't tell your mom. Is that okay to do, or do you think that is sort of teaching our kids that lying is an okay thing to do?
I think it's a slippery slope. I think that if you start to come, if you start having that approach like really early on, like, oh, we're going to do this, don't tell, your mom or your dad, it can become like a slippery slope, because what they take from that lesson is like, oh, there are certain occasions where I don't have to be as open with my parents or with both parents as I should be. And it's kind of contradictory to other lessons you might be trying to teach them. Like, if you ever need to talk to me about anything, if you ever need anything, you can come to me. Because already the lesson is kind of like, well, not exactly everything, there's going to be some instances where maybe I can't or shouldn't. And so I think it's just being careful. It's a slippery slope. And I don't think that when it comes to being united with your spouse, I don't think there's anything wrong with, keeping them in the loop. Maybe they might even tell you, what, that is great that you told me that, but maybe that was something that should have stayed between you and your son. If it's like a particular father-son thing, or mother-daughter thing, sometimes, I would let my wife know, but I do realize that there might be situations where, she'd be like, you know what, thank you for letting me know, but that is a conversation that can be kept between you and your son as well. So I think it's just, a matter of navigating it. But I do believe there's no downside to try to navigate that together. And that's even a conversation that you can have with your spouse too ahead of time, being like, hey, are there some things that you would rather me not tell you about if I want to do it with my son or daughter or something like that. But yeah, it just comes back to having that communication too.
Shifting gears a little bit, we've talked about all of these, the family dynamics of, communication, dying, death. One of the things that I feel like we lack in this day and age is family worship. And I feel like a lot of these things, the art of communication, the explanation of some of these other, heavy topics, could be resolved with family time and family worship.
Absolutely.
And one of the things, and I remember doing this. I remember doing this with my parents for a while. Friday nights, if we didn't go to church, we had our own little Vesper service at, Friday nights to receive the Sabbath. It wasn't an all the time thing that we would do it during the week, but receiving the Sabbath was always one of those things that we would do, whether it was at church or at home. We would always do that. But there was a point where it wasn't as interesting anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe it was the inconsistency of it at times. Maybe it was just because we got into that age where it didn't really matter to us anymore. We really didn't care for it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So one, would you recommend from an early age to do family worship? And how do we keep family worship interesting? Not how do we keep them busy, but how do we make family worship interesting and engaging and meaningful to our kids?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I think I really like what you said about it's not about keeping them busy. And I think that's really important to keep in mind that when we have family worship, it's not about checking off some list like, oh, do I have family worship? Yes, we do. And, you check it off. It's not about trying to just keep them entertained so that they don't get distracted with other things. You're actually trying to create a space and a time where you're worshiping God together as a family. And I definitely believe that that it's definitely going to stem how that happens. What that looks like is going to come from how you as a parent and as a family relate to church. If you see church as something that you just go to as kind of like entertainment, as just something, interesting that you do, then that's going to reflect in your family worship, and it's going to make it even more difficult to have something dynamic, something interesting, because church itself hasn't been an experience where you go and you actually go to worship, the creator of all things. And so, number one, I would definitely think that it's important to start early and have that worship time. But I think it's important to keep in mind as well that as your kids grow, as your family changes, the way that you do family worship should also change and grow with them too. So the way that, you do worship with, a toddler or a baby is going to be different from how you do worship with your teenagers later on. And so as they grow, you might want to start thinking about incorporating maybe more difficult conversations or more interesting conversations into the mix as they grow older. So that way, conversations that they want to have, it might be, they might ask you about sex. They might ask you about faith. They might ask you about God's existence, but be willing to have those conversations with them so that family worship becomes something where you worship God together. But they also realize that family worship is a time where we can also express ourselves and have that open dialogue, not just with the family, but with God as well. And so I would definitely, encourage those two things.
No, I think what you said is very, very important, that family worship should be a time where we have open communication and where we can ask those difficult questions. A lot of the times we tend to say, well, we give a pretty bland answer and expect the kids to walk away with an understanding, and that's not the reality. I don't think that has been the reality for a long time, or we used to think that was a reality. And it's one of the things that I both look forward to and scares me for when my daughter gets to that age of, am I going to be prepared to answer these questions? And I think, family worship isn't just about what am I doing with my kids? It's how am I preparing myself to guide my family, as the head of the household, as and the Bible tells us that the man is the head of the household. He is the one that is leading, in the spiritual journey in the home. We should be the ones that are preparing our families. How do we prepare ourselves to minister to our families?
That's an excellent question. I believe that to be as prepared as you can be is something that you have to keep in mind at the perspective of like always being willing to learn. You're always learning about something. And one of the things that Jesus did that is, Jesus is our ultimate example for this, for how to minister in general, not just to our families, but to people. But one of the things that he did was that he drew life lessons, eternal lessons from his surroundings, from everywhere that he was. There was no opportunity, no place where he was that wasn't out of reach of like, oh, I can use this to impart some lesson, to the people that are in front of me. So I think we kind of have to have that kind of mentality as well, that it's, learning about God, learning about faith, being on that journey is not just something that happens within the confines of the walls of the church. It's something that can happen when we're at work, when we're at school, when we're, just having a great time together. There is all of those experiences, can teach us something about our relationship with God. And so I think one of the ways that we can be prepared as parents, to have those conversations in the future, and even to have those conversations with our kids right now is being willing to see the experiences that we go through, that they're going through, and trying to trying to find ways to connect their experiences with what God might be doing in their lives or what God has taught us as well. I do believe that doing that, taking that approach, will help those lessons to be cemented even more so in their minds as they grow older. Because how many of us can actually remember all the words, in a sermon? But how many of us actually remember, the sermon be connected to an experience that we had too? It just creates just a stronger memory and a stronger reinforcement for that lesson too.
And one final question for you. We talk about keeping our kids engaged, and when it comes to worship, and how do we achieve that? How do we get them involved in church, or how do we keep them active in church? We don't want church to be a place where we just throw a bunch of different things on them that, wow, look, it's so pretty. It's no, how do we keep them engaged and active in church? I think that's one of the biggest things now, is that we're losing a lot of the youth very early on. So how do we prevent that?
Great question. The first thing that pops into my mind is encourage them to go after and use their gifts for God's honor and glory. I think that is ultimately the best thing we can do. I think so many times we're more concerned with what's going to look right. And so we'll take our kids and we'll say like, okay, our church has Pathfinders. So therefore you have to be in Pathfinders and you have to love it. You have to enjoy it. And or different activities too, like there's choir or singing, like, okay, you have to do that because you have to be involved. It's not so much about being involved as it is helping them discover the talents and the gifts that God gave to them, and being willing to help them use that and find ways to use that for God's honor and glory. Now, that is kind of tricky because many of our churches might not be equipped or have, the necessary resources to facilitate all the gifts that our kids might be displaying or might have an inclination towards. So in that sense, you might have to get a little bit creative. If you see that your son or your daughter or even your family has the gift for singing or teaching or things like that, but there isn't really a space where that they can where that's already exists within the church, that might be an opportunity that God is calling you to start that space within that church. And it might be that it starts off really small, that it's a ministry that starts off with just you, your family, and a couple of other families. But when we take that time to invest in the talents that our kids have, not just that they might already have, but helping them to discover what God might have gifted them with, it's never time wasted. And I believe that that's one of the ways that we can keep them active in the church too, is helping them find ways that they can use their talents for God. I remember I had a young person that was incredibly gifted at drawing, and he loved to draw. He loved art. He loved, being artistic and creative like that. But when it came to church, there wasn't really like a ministry or something already started that was like, okay, this is where you can show your talent or something like that. So what eventually happened is, we in one of the times that he had to that he got a chance to preach, he incorporated his art into the sermon. And so as he was preaching, he was drawing something, and that eventually turned into something that a passion for him and something that a lot of people enjoyed. And so, yeah, it just comes back to helping them discover the gifts and talents that God gave them, and helping them to see and guiding them in how can you use that? Helping them ask themselves that, how can I use this gift to benefit someone else, to benefit, for God, for his honor, for his glory, and to be a blessing to someone else. So it definitely, comes back to their gifts and talents that they have.
Pastor, I really want to thank you, especially for answering this last question, because I do feel that a lot of the times, I grew up in Pathfinders, I grew up in Adventures, I grew up in club ministry, and I would feel so bad if my daughter one day is like, you know what, I don't want to be in club ministry. I want to go and do something else, because I want her to experience the same things that I did, but understanding that every child is different and that my child may not like club ministry. Maybe she likes music, and maybe she wants to learn how to play the piano, or she wants to learn how to play the guitar, or she wants to, serve in the church or do something else. And that's the way to keep her involved and active. I think, that's a great piece of advice, and something that we can take with us as parents and walk away in the way that we're raising our kids, and to help them discover the talents that God has given them. Because I think a lot of the times we want to live vicariously through our children, and we want them to grow up and do the exact same things that we did. And that's not the reality. God made us individuals for a reason, and understanding that helps us to maintain our youth. Helping us to understand that they're all different. They're not going to be the same. Their attitudes are different, but maybe one is cut out to be a deacon and the other one maybe isn't. Maybe the other one wants to go and help with, just, parking lot duty. Maybe that's what he wants to do.
Absolutely.
So again, I really, really want to thank you so much for this conversation. It's been very helpful, very insightful. I wish we had more time. We could keep talking about family dynamics all night, but Pastor Escalante, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And to our family that's watching, we really want to thank you for joining us this evening for another episode of On the Couch. And tune in next week, where we will continue to talk about topics such as family dynamics, divorce, counseling, all different types of topics. And if you have any questions, please feel free to send them to onthecouchministry@gmail.com for us to be able to answer those questions, because we really, this ministry is for you. We want to engage with you. We want to keep you guys in the loop, and we want to answer those hard questions that maybe you haven't gotten answers to. So we want to thank you again for joining us this evening. Pastor Escalante, thank you so much, and we'll see you for the next episode.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed my time with you.